And it's great that we've got Professor Bob White here, who's Associate Director of the Faraday Institute. Bob is the Professor of Geophysics here in Cambridge University. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society. If you want to know about volcanoes and whether you're going to have an earthquake in the country you're going back to, anything like that, then also Bob is the person to talk to. And Bob's, especially in the past few years, been doing a huge amount of speaking and indeed writing on the whole area of care for the environment. And his book, I think, is just coming out soon, isn't it, on that topic. I'm sure we'll hear about that. So very pleased that Bob is going to talk to us about a very practical issue that affects us all, why care for the environment. So thanks, Bob.
But today, I'm going to focus really just on one aspect of the environment, because you could talk about all sorts of things. And the aspect that I'm going to talk about is global climate change. Because it's high on the public agenda at the minute, so I think it's a useful thing to talk about. Tony Blair said that climate change is the world's greatest environmental challenge. In fact, he went on to say that it's so far-reaching in its impact and irreversible in its destructive power that it alters radically human existence. That's quite a surprising statement from an incumbent Prime Minister, actually, to raise these big long-term issues. I suppose you would expect church people to say things about it. Richard Chartres, who's the Bishop of London, captured headlines at the end of last year by suggesting that making selfish choices such as flying on holiday or buying a large car are a symptom of sin, he said. Yeah, it slightly bemused quite a lot of people, actually, and the headline writers, and led to a lot of interesting discussion about what sin was. But I think he was exactly right to raise that issue. Other people like Sir David King, who's the government chief scientist, has described climate change as a bigger threat than terrorism. And we know how concerned the world is about terrorism now. Sir John Houghton, who's formerly head of the Met Office and was head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, he picked up the same sort of idea in a newspaper article not long ago when he said that climate change was a weapon of mass destruction. So when church and secular leaders and scientists and politicians are all speaking in similar ways about the importance of the issue, I think it's useful for religious people to take note of it and to consider how their faith affects their response to these issues. And in fact, a growing interest in environmental issues is one that it can be found in, I think, most, if not all, of the world's major faiths, because it has such a large-scale implications for global environmental disaster. I think it's really interesting that I mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a bit of a mouthful, the IPCC. It's a really interesting body because here is a body of people from every nation on Earth, of scientists, 2,500 scientists, who have worked together and come to a common mind on this issue. And they've just published last month their 4th assessment report. They've been publishing one about every 4 years or so. And it's almost unprecedented for that amount of commonality of mind to occur across all faiths, all peoples, all nations. And actually I think that the issue of climate change might be one that can actually pull together in dialogue and partnership people from many different faith backgrounds, many different cultural backgrounds, many different religious backgrounds and social backgrounds and nations. So I think it's a huge opportunity actually to engage for faith people. But in this talk I'm going to focus specifically on a Christian attitude to environmental change and particularly to climate change, as I say. Not because I think the other attitudes are important, but because that's the faith stance I come from. But also it is 11 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning and we are sitting in a theological college, so it's not inappropriate, is it, to discuss the Christian attitude to it. And I think actually we have an incredible opportunity actually in this issue, which the church by and large, at least in Britain, has sidestepped and not sort of addressed head on. We have an incredible opportunity to carry a distinctive Christian message of hope as well as challenge into the debate. I think from the school's perspective, for teachers, I think the issue of climate change is an incredibly useful opportunity. You can approach it from science, as I know some people do. We were just talking last night about how if you had a 100 watt light bulb, just a single light bulb in your hall, burning 10 hours per day, how much would that cost you? Oh, it's a really interesting calculation to do in your physics class. And the answer, astonishingly in Britain, at current electricity prices, is over £50 just to burn that one bulb. So, how much energy is your home burning in light bulbs that aren't switched off? Is an interesting issue. And at least in my experience, children have much more impetus to take home this sort of message to their parents than the other way around. So I think it's a great opportunity. Obviously, you can address ethical and moral issues because, as I'll talk about in a minute, the impact of climate change is disproportionately on the poor and the marginalised in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. And yet the people who have had the benefits of cheap and free almost energy and burning fossil fuels are us in the high-income countries. We don't suffer the consequences so much, and they do. That's a very interesting moral and ethical question, which people, it'd be great to address that in the classroom as well as amongst ourselves. Even down to things like representation in the media. I think you could have some really interesting discussions with your classes about the way the media loves to pick controversial subjects and find an extreme position. A contemporary sort of illustration of that is just a few weeks ago there was a Channel 4 documentary which was sceptical about climate change. Great discussion starter. I can talk about the strengths and weaknesses, the way they showed some truths and then some half-truths and didn't show some truths in that programme. I think that'd be a really useful sort of thing. So a lot of scope, I think, for looking at these issues in the classroom, as well as educating people, go the other way, as well as educating adults, actually. As I say, I think there has been very little impetus to do that within the churches, and church people, of all people, I think, should be leading in this area. And I'm going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to talk first about scientific issues about global climate change, and then I'm going to talk about some of the theological issues which we might underpin our understanding of a response to climate change. And again, as I said, I'll talk specifically from a Christian perspective. So let's launch into just the first half of the talk. I'll talk about some of the scientific issues. What do we know about climate change? Much of this is in the public domain. And much of it, you know, I mean, it's a beautiful sunny day today out in Cambridge. 9 of the 10 warmest years on record globally were in the last decade. You can't really avoid noticing that. Turns out 98 was the warmest year on record globally. Every single month of the first 8 months of that year broke records globally for temperature. It's a bit hard to avoid this. 2006 was the hottest year on record in central England and the USA. Temperatures of 37.6, the highest temperature in Wales, was absolute record in July. It was the hottest July ever known in Britain. The average was 19.7 centigrade. It's easy to see these things happening all around us. And the significant difference from previous times is that the rate of increase of global temperature is unprecedented. We've never seen that before. And just looking at this last winter that's just finished, 2006-2007 winter, is the warmest winter on record. Just records have just been broken year on year on year. So there's no doubt that global warming is happening, and one of the really interesting things about the IPCC report that came out last month, the fourth one in the series, was that for the first time ever they said that warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Now, unequivocal is not a word that you can take in any other way than the fact that it's happening. They have a category to say it's more than 99% certain. That is virtually certain. That's what the IPCC use. Unequivocal. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And that is signed up to by every single nation in the world. Every representative on the IPCC, including the USA, of course. So, no doubt that it's happening. The temperature rise is actually a bit more than 0.7, or it's nearer 0.8 now. Happened up to date, which might not sound very much, but as I'll show you in a minute, that is very significant average rise in temperature. Well, here's a plot, a graph which covers the last 1,000 years, and you can see the temperature toddling along, sort of pretty steady, and shooting up at the end. Sometimes it's called a hockey stick diagram. not much doubt about this rate of change here. It's gone way outside the natural variability that's ever been seen. This is Northern Hemisphere temperatures. If you look in a bit more detail at the last 150 years, you see quite an interesting thing. And this feeds back into that Channel 4 documentary that was sceptical of climate change. You see that the temperature rather, has gone up and down a bit. There's quite a big dip in the second half of the 20th century, from 1940 through to 1980. And then it goes up again. And some people say, well, it's just natural variability, isn't it? They say this is where there was heavy industrialization in the world, post-Second World War, and the temperature went down. So how can you say that that's responsible for temperature increase? That's exactly the tack that Channel 4 programme took. But what they didn't tell you is there's a perfectly good explanation for that. And it's this, that actually we were very dirty in our industry through that period, and actually starting in the middle of the 20th century, we actually started cleaning up the air. There were anti-pollution laws passed. For instance, in London, there used to be awful smogs from coal-burning fires, which subsequently were banned. You had to use smokeless fuel. And even as recently as 1950, 4,000 people died in one particular smog in London. And that's significant to climate change because all those particles in the air, which Monet, for instance, painted beautiful pictures of in 1900, this was when he was living in London for a bit. You can look at the colours on his paintings and they're really accurate. You can work out from the spectroscopy of those colours how much pollution there was. And it works. In fact, I mean, artists have looked at where the sun was when he painted this and they can work out which room he was living in and shown it's consistent with a room he's living on the other side of the River Thames as he painted the houses upon it. So no doubt that this pollution has been around for a long time. And it's all that muck in the air, all the dust, the particles, that actually, it turns out, reflect some of the sunlight and actually caused a decrease in temperature. Those of us that are older enough will remember scares about nuclear winters, if ever there was a nuclear warfare, that all the dust thrown into the air would actually cause the temperature to plummet. So that's what was happening, and that's why the temperature was depressed. And actually it depressed the underlying trend, which was upward from global warming caused by humans. And when the air was cleared up in the 70s and 80s, then you see the underlying trend continue, and actually it's accelerating. It's accelerating so that it's about 0.2 degrees per decade at the moment. So that's temperature. Actually, I should just say that global warming is not altogether a bad thing, and I want to make that clear before I go on, because if there wasn't global warming, the temperature on Earth now would be about minus 18 degrees centigrade, it'd be about 30 degrees centigrade colder than it is, and the Earth will be uninhabitable. So most of that global warming is from water vapour and carbon dioxide, and it's a good thing. There is some controversial evidence that from time to time the Earth has actually gone into what's called a snowball Earth. It's got covered in ice. It's got cold enough that there's a complete ice layer over the whole Earth. Last time was quite a long time ago, several hundred million years, you don't have to worry about it. And interestingly, we only got out of that, they think, by the fact that volcanic eruptions occurred under the ice cap and threw a lot of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air and actually allowed the atmosphere to warm up again. So the Earth can respond, it can get hotter and colder, but the interesting thing is that actually for the last 4,000 million years the Earth has maintained a temperature long term between 0 degrees and 100 degrees. So in other words, the water vapour hasn't all boiled off and nor has it all frozen, which makes it uniquely suitable for life as we know it. So global warming is good. What is bad now is the rate of change of global warming. Because what's different now from the past is that if it got a little bit too hot to live in Africa, you could leave Africa and move north as a population, as animals or as people. But of course now people live in carefully circumscribed regions and you fight wars over territory. That's what wars are usually about. So you can't just leave the patch of land where you live and go somewhere else, not easily, without causing huge disruption. And I'll come back to that a bit later on. Well, summer 2003 was particularly hot in Europe, And it turns out that is the summer temperature. And in the background in red are climate models, and the black is the actual observed temperature change over a century. And this was outside all the expected trends. And that's one of the significant things about global climate change. It makes the extremes more extreme. And in this particular summer, 20,000 people died in France, actually mostly in Paris, as a result of these extraordinarily high temperatures which were occurring in July. And it was mostly the very old and the very young who died, the marginalised, who couldn't cope with the rapid temperature changes. So this is happening on our doorstep as well. But it has been estimated by a paper which was published actually in 2000, it's 7 years out of date now, in Nature, that even then there were an estimated 150,000 additional deaths per year as a result of climate change. That's published in the premier scientific journal of the world, Nature, so it's not just a number pulled out of a hat. And you can see exactly where they die. The green figures are a little affected, the green areas. So the high-income countries in the Northern Hemisphere didn't really matter, you know, it's just, we are rather like a little bit nicer weather, don't we? You can go to the Costa del Brighton instead of freezing. But look at where the people are affected. It's in Asia, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This is where mortality increases. Now, I should say these figures are controversial insofar as it's quite hard sometimes to actually work out exactly the causes of death. But if you're living on the edge already and the rainfall fails, there's a drought for 3 years, that can push you over the edge. If you're living in an area where there's a lot more rainfall, then there's a lot more disease perhaps, and you can die from disease, particularly because you're living on the edge, so you don't have those resources to fight it. So there is some uncertainty about it, but I think there is no doubt about the impact of climate change on mortality. And that's where I said at the beginning, there is a moral responsibility on us, because it's us that have caused this, and yet we're not suffering the effects of it. Well, you can see the effects of climate change. For instance, if you look at glaciers, there's no doubt that glaciers are retreating. This is one in Argentina, and photo in 1928 at the top, 2004 at the bottom, taken from the same location. The ice is gone. Here's one in the Alps, in Austria, a photo taken in 1875, and then somebody went back to the exact same spot and took another photo in 2004, no ice left. You can see the shape of the mountains at the back, so you can see it's the same location. And that's just happening all over the world. Glaciers are retreating. But the interesting thing is that there is a big time lag in glaciers retreating because there's a lot of thermal energy to melt ice. It just takes a long time to melt ice. That's why if you put ice in your drink on a very hot day, it stays as ice for a little while. It doesn't immediately turn to water. And so actually the glaciers are lagging behind what's actually happening. And you may have seen these sort of pictures of the Arctic summer sea ice could disappear by the latter half of this century. So there's no doubt that the climate is changing. It is unequivocal. Well, what causes it? What causes warming is the greenhouse effect, which is that it turns out that the atmosphere is rather like a blanket. So energy coming in from the sun at short wavelength gets absorbed by the earth. It's about 1,000 watts per square metre, so it's a 1 bar electric fire for this sort of size. If you did that for very long, we'd fry very quickly. So most of that energy is radiated back out. There is a balance between the incoming and the outgoing, otherwise we'd get hotter or colder. But there is one significant change when the energy is radiated back. It's radiated out at longer wavelengths, at infrared wavelengths. Some of you might have cookers, which are infrared cookers, which heat up by infrared. And actually they're so dangerous because you can't see it. They usually put some little light, an LED or something, to tell you when it's switched on, so you know it's hot. And as that infrared escapes, it actually warms up the lower atmosphere, and that expands. So it's like thickening up a blanket around the Earth, so the Earth underneath it gets hotter. That's what the greenhouse effect is. And greenhouse effect is caused by water vapour, as I said. It's caused by carbon dioxide, which is something we're going to talk about mostly, and that's the dominant effect. Methane also has an effect, and then some other gases also do. Now, I put methane up because it is 22 times more powerful in its greenhouse effect than is carbon dioxide. So you don't need very much methane to have a big effect. There are some other things like halocarbons, which are 20,000 times more effective than carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, there's very small amounts of those in the atmosphere. But there's just a funny little story I should tell you about methane, because it turns out that there's 1.7 billion cows in the world, and they each produce 500 litres of methane. You can work out how they produce it yourself. And actually, the greenhouse warming effect of cattle in the world is 18% of the total, which is more than all the transport sectors put together. That's more than all the ships and cars and trains and planes and buses put together. So it is an important effect, and again I think this speaks to some of the ethical issues about eating a lot of meat. It's very well observed that as nations get more affluent, they spend more money on meat. And meat, of course, uses about 10 times the resources to make a kilogram of meat compared to a kilogram of protein. So there is an argument for a bias towards vegetarianism just because of the climate change effects, interestingly. Well, is humanity responsible for global warming? I've already answered that, partly by saying that the IPCC came out saying it was very likely, that means more than 95% certain, or more than 9 chances out of 10 that humans have been responsible. And let me just show you one example from their climate modelling, because again that Channel 4 documentary said, oh well, changes are all natural anyway, so we don't need to worry about them. Well, even that you can debate, because that changes are occurring is unequivocal, so we do have to worry about them whatever the cause, but I think I want to convince you that the cause is actually due to what we, humankind, have done. This blue figure is the result of a lot of climate models, which are getting quite good now, over the last century, almost over the last 80 years. And the width of the blue is the uncertainty or the range of different models with different parameters. And there is some variation. It goes up and down a couple of tenths of a degree over that period. But if you look at the observed temperature variation over that same period, it diverges from this natural variation. Now, in this natural variation in the models, they put in solar changes, they put in volcanic effects, because a big volcano puts a lot of material into both dust, which can cool it, and greenhouse gases, which can warm the atmosphere. So let me show you finally, in pink, the models which consider not only the natural variation, but also the effect of human-induced gases. And that is like that, which fits the observations really rather well. So we are getting better at modelling, and we can model the observed variations. And I think just this one diagram shows you that the warming is due to man-made effects, not just to natural variation. Another diagram, in fact, that they showed on that Channel 4 documentary was the temperature difference. In fact, you can go back further. You can go back 347 years in England with thermometer records. It's the longest continuous record in the world. But you can go back longer than that by looking at other proxies. And one particularly interesting thing to do is to drill an ice core. You can get back to 600,000 years that way. You find little bubbles in the ice. You can look at the composition of the bubbles and work out the temperature of the air at the time that bubble of air was trapped in the ice. And you can count the annual layers and just count back, so you get a time scale from it as well. That's what's been done here. You can look at oxygen isotopes as proxies to get the temperature. And the temperature has varied by up to 10 degrees through ice ages. Now, that rather than saying that is, well, it's all right, it's just natural, that is to me very scary, because it means the Earth can respond with big climate changes, big temperature changes, if you trigger it in the right way. So the Earth will certainly respond, and it certainly will get hotter. There's nothing magic to say it won't, because it's done it in the past. But this is temperature change on a time scale, in this case of 120,000 years, which is well understood. It's due to variations in the circulation, in the way that the Earth goes around the Sun. It's called a Milankovitch cycle. It's been understood for many decades that you get nearer and further away, so it changes the global climate. You also get changes on a 21,000 year timescale and on a 410,000 year timescale. And there are many small glaciations in this period which are due to that 21,000 year timescale. Now the thing that they showed on the Channel 4 documentary was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which mirrors it very straightforwardly. But they made a causal link. They said because the temperature was driven by external planetary motions, which it is in the Milankovitch cycle, therefore the carbon dioxide follows it and we don't have to worry about it, which misses the vital point that the temperature change that glaciations reflect itself affects the carbon dioxide. So they're intricately linked, and you can see how good the link is. And this is a diagram that Channel 4 showed to say we don't have to worry about it. And this is where I say that it's interesting to look at the things they didn't say, because the omission that they didn't put in was what carbon dioxide has done since this graph stops in the last 50 years. And I think that's a culpable omission, because if you put it in, this is what carbon dioxide has done. It's now sitting at about 380 parts per million. Pre-industrial revolution, it was about 280. It's gone up that much in our lifetime, more or less. And if that much carbon dioxide change causes that much temperature change, that causes 6 or 7 degrees temperature change, just think what that much is going to cause. It's going to cause another 5 or 6 and more temperature change. So this is something to be really worried about. If we don't do anything about the way we're living now, we'll end up here by the end of this century. The target that people are aiming for is to end up here somewhere, and I'll show you the effect of that in the next couple of slides. It's still double what it was before the Industrial Revolution, and that is going to cause several degrees of warming, with consequences I'll show you in a minute. So I think this is a really interesting demonstration of the half-truths that that programme, for instance, showed. It showed a half-truth which was correct, it didn't show the whole truth which is shown here, and about which we really, really need to be concerned. But I can't leave the matter before I just mention something about global population, because if you go back to 10,000 years BC, which we were talking about last night, Neolithic farming, when human societies really got going in settled communities with farming and so on, the population was very small, and it didn't actually change very much for a long, long time, until this is what is happening in the 20th century. It's just rocketing up. And this, of course, is part of the problem of global climate change. The Earth has never seen this many people before, and it's changing at a rate which is unprecedented. Let's just blow up the last couple of hundred years here and a projection forward. This is the projection over that period. A couple of things to point out. The population trebled over the 20th century. Even in my lifetime, it's more than doubled. It is incredible. Actually, there are more people under 18, and this is relevant to you living today, than there are people over 18. There's more children alive today than there are adults. Isn't that amazing? There's more people alive today than have ever lived before in the whole of human history, because of this exponential rate of change. I mean, that certainly gives an added impetus to the harvest is ripe, when Jesus said, go into the fields because the harvest is ripe. This change is very significant. Now you will see that statisticians think it will plateau out. We're presently at about 6 billion. It might plateau out at about double that. Because as people get more affluent, they have fewer children, their children are more likely to survive, so they don't have to have 10 children in order to survive. And in fact, in Britain at the moment, the natural replacement rate is below, well, the natural reproduction rate of indigenous British people is below replacement rate, and it's only maintained by immigration. So it will flatten out, but we're going to have double the people we have now, probably, unless some catastrophe happens. Well, this is a picture of carbon dioxide that I showed you earlier, shooting up, and actually it does, in this idea, if we just carry on as we are now, this basically is mimicking that population increase. So it will flatten out, but a lot higher than it is at the moment. That's if we don't do anything. If we slowly reduce the rate at which we burn fossil fuels, because they of course are the reason for bringing primarily the reason for bringing carbon, which has been locked underground for 100 million years, into the atmosphere very, very quickly. The carbon would just gradually increase. If we make a really concerted effort from now on, we could decrease the amount of carbon we use. But the next one shows you the temperature change from those three scenarios. If we carry on as we are now, by the end of this century, temperature will be 4 or 5 degrees, or maybe even more, because there's complicated feedbacks which give some uncertainty above what they are now. If we just try to decrease our use slowly, it'll still go up 3 degrees. If we make a really concerted effort, it's still going to go up 2 degrees. And that's because there are such long time lags in the system. As I'll show you in a minute, the thermal capacity of the oceans is so big that even if we stop producing carbon dioxide now, completely, CO2, this decrease now, the sea level would continue to rise for the next 500 or 800 years as they slowly warms up and expands. And the effect of this, again, this is sort of mirroring something I said at the beginning. This is temperature increase. The red ones are hot. The blue areas, well, that's no change, more or less, at naught. You can see the places that get really hot at the end of this century compared to the end of the last century are Northern Africa, this belt through India, Northern Africa, Sri Lanka, and Southern Africa here. Siberia, the high-level areas of northern Canada. Now, if you happen to be a farmer in Canada, you might say, that's great, you can grow grain in Siberia. It would be great to grow grain in what is now tundra. That would be good. But it's not so good if you're already living marginal lives in these areas. Now, it turns out that rainfall does a similar thing. Rainfall goes up in some latitudes and goes down dramatically in others. And poor old Africa is the one that keeps getting hit by these massive changes. The next three slides I won't dwell on particularly, but the IPCC has done a lot of different projections of different scenarios about how much we might change our lifestyle, population increase and so on. But they all show temperature increases from, in this case, the decade beginning 2020 to the decade at the end of this century. The average temperature going up, well, you can't see the scale until I put it on, going up several degrees, so that what is normal now will be quite cool then. The temperature will be several degrees C hotter in the future. And these are just slightly different scenarios, but this is a sort of average scenario. This is the most likely thing to happen, as far as we can tell, at the present day. It is something we should really, really be concerned about. If you look at the amount of carbon dioxide that we make, of course it does vary hugely by where you live. The USA always comes out top, though Australia and New Zealand, interestingly, is pretty near the top too, partly because there's 4 million people and 40 million sheep in New Zealand. Europe, you shouldn't really look at this and feel smug, even though Europe is half of the USA, because the equitable distribution, if we allowed everybody to have their share, would be this blue line here. And of course, places like China and India, quite properly, want to increase their standard of living up to those of the high-income countries. This is an interesting one because this is a plot of carbon production per person against population. So although each person in China only produces a tenth of what each person in the USA produces in terms of carbon dioxide, there's an awful lot of them. There's 1 billion people in China. So the total contribution actually is much the same at the present day as the USA. So this is the real challenge that faces us. How can we allow nations like India, Southeast Asia, China to increase their standard of living to something similar to ours, while at the same time decreasing our carbon production without necessarily changing our standard of living? Now, I think there are ways that can be done, but they require willpower to do. And this just says the same thing again, that 1/6 of the world's population produces more than half the pollution, and that's us, I'm afraid. And 1/6 of the world's population, which are most vulnerable to change, produce only 3% of the pollution. Here's a little thing just to think about as you drive home, if you drove here. Each litre of petrol produces 2.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So every mile it's 380 grams. You know, it's a bag of sugar every few miles. If you buy bags of sugar in £2 bags like we do. So when I drove here, I produced several kilograms of carbon dioxide. just driving here from my home. The next picture is just, well, it's a domestic one because it's my daughter driving a Land Rover in Iceland where I do field work. She came as a driver. These produce, of course, even more than those figures there. These are real issues to think about what sort of car you drive and why. Well, what about the future? Interestingly, this plot here shows what we've used on the right-hand side over history, really, up to now. We've produced about 500 gigatons of carbon from oil in green and a little bit from gas and a lot from coal in blue. Now on the left three columns are what we think still remains in the earth to be used. The green is what we've used, the red is what remains. So we've used about half the oil, a bit less than half the gas, but there's tons of coal left. There's enough coal even at present usage to last several hundred years. And that is actually a real problem because coal is really, really dirty. It's the worst of these things because not only does it produce a lot of carbon dioxide, it's produced a lot of particulates too. Of course, it's horrible stuff. People are going to use this, I have no doubt. The oil is there, the gas is there, people will use it, but you can't pretend they won't. So we've got to think of ways to prevent the carbon dioxide getting into the atmosphere. And there are interesting technological ideas, for instance, on a power station to capture the carbon dioxide and then pump it underground away again. So you get the use of the energy, but you get rid of the pollution. It's called carbon capture and storage. And there's pilot schemes in Britain and in China. And China actually is the place that is biggest potential for this carbon capture because they're opening a new coal-fired power station every week at the moment with dirty technology. Now, we'll only get around this if we have global agreement to do so. Sea level rise, as I said, if we stop producing, this is a 1% increase in carbon dioxide over 60 years. Stop producing carbon dioxide, sea level just keeps on going and going and going. We've done it already, and our children are going to suffer from it, and our grandchildren, and their children. Why care for the environment? Well, one of the issues, as I said earlier, is that it's the rapid change which is the issue. The Earth has seen changes like this before, but the rapidity of it now is greater than has ever been seen before. And you might not know this, but it's actually floods which are one of the most dangerous things in the world. It's not earthquakes, it's not volcanoes, actually, it's floods. Some of you might even remember back to 1970 in Bangladesh, over 500,000 people died in one single flood on the 13th of November. Bangladesh is a country that lies very close to sea level, very vulnerable to it. But in China, and we hear less about this because of it's just more isolated and there was a communist rule for many years. 1887, up to 2 million people died in a flood of the Yellow River. Same river, 1931, maybe 4 million nearly, between 1 and 4 million. It's very hard to know the numbers. And in the 20th century, it's been estimated that floods affect 100 million people per year. It is a big issue. And at current expectations, because the intensity of storms increases as you get a hotter world, mainly because there's more water vapour in the world, it's reckoned that about half the world population will be at risk from storms. Well, that's because people live in river valleys where there's water or they live by the sea, so they are vulnerable to it. That is a huge number. And it's not just climate change, land use also, of course, affects it. People strip down trees and then there's nothing to stop the water and it gushes off the mountains very fast and you get big floods. Here's a picture, for instance, of what would happen if there was a 1 metre sea level rise in northwest Europe. Well, it's probably all right. We could probably cope with it in northwest Europe because we just build a higher Thames barrage and we persuade people to move from their cliffside residences in various places on the east coast. I suppose in Netherlands they build a bigger polder, a bigger wall to keep out the sea. But if you live in Bangladesh, which is a deltaic area, there are 10 million people living within 1 metre of sea level. They can't build a wall around the delta. So they'll just have to move. And some people have already had to move because of increases already. And in fact, if you just look at increases, this is going up to 6 metres, which won't happen this century, but will in future centuries. Of course, it just covers more and more area. And I could go around the world and do this, but even 1 metre of sea level would displace 100 million people globally. It's huge numbers. And if you just look at those 6 metres I've put in there, over the next, as that sea level rose over 6 million over 6 metres, up to 500,000 people would just lose their livelihoods. They have to move because their land is underwater, their house is underwater. So these are significant things. Now, sea level rise is slower than other things, as I said, but we have committed the world to it already, and it's the rich countries that can respond to it. If you live in the Maldives, it's bad luck, isn't it, really? We can respond to it here, they can't. And it's been estimated that even as by the middle of this century, there'll be something like 150 to 200 million environmental refugees. I think already environmental refugees exceed refugees from traditional reasons like war. So it is already an issue, and actually most of our nations that are represented here know the sort of problems that are raised by immigration. It's not that it's wrong, but society doesn't find it easy to cope with a lot of people moving in. I mean, that's another perspective where Christians could certainly have something to say about it. Well, that's scientific issues. And the last bit of the talk, really, I want to talk about theological issues from a Christian perspective. And I want to give 4 reasons why we should care for the environment. The first is because God cares for it. Seems to me a good reason that we should, therefore. If it's something he cares about, we should too. I want to point out that it's part of what it means to be human, to steward the earth. It's a command that God gave us right at the beginning. So it's part of being human to do this. And if we don't do it, we're in some sense subhuman. An obvious point, actually, from what I've been saying, is that caring for the environment is a way to love our neighbour. Our neighbour might not be next door, they might be in sub-Saharan Africa, or they might be an intergenerational neighbour, they might be children or grandchildren. But what we do matters to them. If we really care for them, then it matters what we do. And I want to finish by saying that there is a hope for the creation, and this is a specifically Christian hope, that there will be a new creation, a new heavens and new earth at the end of time. And so it's worth caring for it now, because this is what it's going to be like for eternity. We're going to be in the same sort of place. Well, let me make some very simple points, really, about the universe and about the fact God cares for it. The very first chapter of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Not much doubt about that, he created it. He exists independently of the universe, and he made it of his own free will. Same thing in the 3rd verse of one of the first Gospels in the New Testament. Through him, and that's talking about Jesus, through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made. It says it twice, through him all things were made. Just in case you didn't get the point, he says it the other way around. By the way, nothing that's been made was made without him. So pretty obvious, God made the universe. That's the first point, of his own free will. If you read the first chapter of Genesis, you can't miss the point that God's universe was good. Now this is in real distinction, say, to those Eastern religions that say you should subdue yourself, should subdue the physical to the spiritual, which is much more important. Because in God's creation, matter matters to God. It's a very materialistic religion, if you like. I shock people sometimes by saying that, but Christianity is really grounded in the material, and it's because God made a material universe that he said was good. Verse 4, he made light, he saw it was good. Verse 10, he made the sea and the dry land, and he says, and it was good. Verse 12, he made the vegetation, plants and trees, and God said it was good. Verse 18, God made the 2 great lights, greater light to govern the day, lesser light to govern the night. Oh, and also, as an afterthought, and he also made the stars, all 10 to the 24 of them. Just threw them into space. He's so creative. God thought it was good. And an interesting point here about reading Genesis. He didn't say in Genesis that he made the sun and the moon, because the sun and the moon were gods that were worshipped in the culture of the time. So just to make sure there's absolutely no mistake in the way people read it, he talked about their function. A greater light to rule the day, a lesser light to rule the night. Just in case people thought he was saying that God made some other gods. God made the light in the day, he saw it was good. Verse 20 was sea creatures and the birds, saw it was good. Wild animals and the creatures. Verse 25, God said, well, you can't really miss the point, can you? It was good, it was good, it was good. And he made humans on the 6th day, verse 31. And God saw all that he'd made, and it was very good. So God made a good creation, and God gloried in his creation, and in turn his creation reflected something of his character. The heavens declare the glory of God, said the psalmist in Psalm 19. Well, we've talked already about how this was in complete contradistinction to the myths that were around at the time. And we know quite a lot about them. Here's a Mesopotamian cuneiform tablet from the 7th century BC, talking about later on the Gilgamesh epic for the flood. Christianity, or at least the Christian gospel, the Judeo-Christian gospel in fact, is standing in complete distinction to that. It's saying that God made a universe of his own free will. It wasn't the accidental product of God's fighting or God's making people to serve them or any of those other myths of the time. He made a universe because he chose to, and it was good. Well, another point we ought to make about the creation is that God sustains it moment by moment. You see that, for instance, in Hebrews 1:3. Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Or again in Colossians 1, Paul talks about through Jesus all things were created. We've already seen that. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, the picture here is of God sustaining the universe, upholding it, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, microsecond by microsecond. It's as if he stopped doing that, it would just fall apart into chaos. He's sustaining it. He's outside of it, but he's immanent in it, sustaining it as well. And that's an important point. It's a bit like a TV show, if you've ever watched a TV show, and you're watching the Jane Austen series on Sunday nights now, which you'll just get home in time to watch. You know, you can engage with the plot and you can cheer with the poor old repressed heroine until the very last scene when she gets her love of her life eventually. And you can really engage with it and watch it and get into the story. But that's only maintained moment by all those electrons coming through and hitting the screen. And as sometimes happens, if somebody unplugs the aerial, you just get a massive white dots all over the screen, complete chaos, no more story. So it's as if God's sustaining the universe. That's a limited metaphor, but there it is. God's sustaining it moment by moment. So it's not at all like the Big Bang theory that God created the earth and just let it get on by itself. That's a very deist view. So why should we care for the environment? Well, because God created it, he said it was good, and he's intimately involved in caring for it, moment by moment. For instance, in Psalm 65, it talks about God caring for the land and watering it, enriching it, drenching its furrows with rain, enabling crops to grow year by year. This is independent of man's agency. The grasslands of the desert overflows, the hills are clothed with gladness, the meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. Here's a picture of creation in its right order, reflecting God's glory. So we should care for the creation because God cares for it. And if we don't, if we neglect it or abuse it or despoil it, we're not only damaging something that's precious to God, but also, in a very real sense, we're preventing the created order from reflecting God's glory fully in the way that he meant it to. So if we're not caring for the world in which we live, it's a bit like the teenagers, you know, when the parents go away for the weekend and they have a wild party in the family home that's been lovingly created for them by their parents, and they destroy it. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. I'm glad it hasn't to me. Or maybe it's the teenagers, which has happened to us, they sort of treat it like a hotel with a fridge to be raided for food and a place to dump dirty clothes, which their mother very generously washes. So that's not the picture of the way we should behave. Second point, we should care for the environment because it's part of what it means to be human. Now what I mean for that, we talked yesterday a little bit about what it means to be made in the image of God. And as I said then, I think one of the important distinctives of being made in God's image is that we can relate to him in a personal way. That is the basis of the Christian faith, really, that sinfulness is turning away from God's rightful place as our sovereign. And Christ's sacrifice was enabling us to come back into that relationship with him. We can love and be loved, we can be creative like God was creative. That's one of the great attributes of humans, great creativity in what they do, whether it's science or arts or music, whatever. And I think a really interesting point is that humans have great yearning for justice. We're moral beings. And time after time I'm struck by the fact that when there's been some horrible crime, like a child being killed, and on the news they report it, there they are interviewing the parents after the judge has brought down his verdict, standing on the steps of the courtroom, and nothing the judge says is going to bring back their child. It's not objectively going to change anything in their circumstances. But time and again they say, we just want to see justice. We just want to see closure on this. And I'm certain that humans have that great yearning for justice, because that is God's nature. We're made in his image. God of all people is just above all things, loving above all things. So, we're made in the image of God, and therefore that means that, in a way, in caring for the earth, we're his vice-regents. We're caring for something he's put us here to care for. It talks about that in Genesis, that he's put us here to have dominion and rule over the world. And being made in God's image reminds me of this brass image from Mesopotamia from 2200 BC or thereabouts. The king used to put up images of himself on the borders of his land, to say, this is my land. I am regent, I am king, sovereign over this. So if we're made in God's image, then we're given some sovereignty over this earth in his place. That's something we're supposed to do as his vice-regents, if you will. And God actually commands us to take care of it in Genesis 1:28 and again 2:15, both the living and the non-living creation. So we're not to be passive spectators of it, but we're to work at ordering and ruling creation without destroying it for our own selfish ends. I mean, a sort of common term nowadays is to be good stewards of it, which captures part of this sense, but I think the Genesis one is even firmer than just stewardship. It's actually having dominion and ruling and ordering it. So we should care for the earth in the way that God himself cared for it, because that enables it to be fruitful. It enables us to live in right relationship with it, and it gives glory to God. And interestingly, when God gives that command in Genesis 1:28, he doesn't just tell humankind to rule over the earth, but he blesses humanity as well. So we're given that privilege of carrying out the mandate of, if you like, delegated dominion in the way that reflects the character and values of God's loving and compassionate kingship for us. And through the Old Testament there's quite a lot of images of that sort of kingship, for instance as a shepherd king or as a servant king, indeed, as Jesus himself said. That's the role he adopted when he came to earth. So it's a rule, a dominion, a stewardship which is directed entirely to the benefit of God's kingdom and his glory, and not to the gain of the king himself in that case. So we should care for the environment because it's good, because God cares for it, because it's part of what it means to be human in this sense I've just described as vice-regents on his behalf. It's obvious that it's part of the way to love our neighbour. From what I've said about climate change, what we do causes problems to other people. We should have responsibility for that. We're not loving them if we're causing them to die from disease or whatever. And of course that was what Jesus brought home very clearly: love your neighbour as yourself. So we really have to think, are we doing that with our lifestyles, with our government rules and regulations about climate change? I don't have to say I don't very often quote Margaret Thatcher, but she got here in the 1980s, long before many of the rest of us did. She said, we don't hold a freehold on our world, but only a full repairing lease. So we have a moral duty, she said, to look after the world, and to hand it on in good order to future generations. Christopher Patten, in his brief lectures, put it much more pithily. He said, living here as though we're intending to stay for good and not just for the weekend. Calvin said this years ago, actually. Calvin said, let everyone regard himself as a steward of God in all things which he possesses, because that's the right order of things. That's what God wants. So we have to think about, how are we using those resources we've got? Is it just and equitable? And it's interesting as you go around, these are just a couple of my holiday snaps. My wife tells me not to think about work while I'm away, but I couldn't resist this. I was in Madeira just a few weeks ago. There's the windmills on the top of Madeira, really windy place, quite a good place to have windmills. Austria is this says here, biomass, it's one of the best European countries for energy use for recycling material and so on. So it's obvious that this is how we love our neighbour, because if what I do affects them, then obviously that's a moral issue on me to change what I do. And then finally I want to say that there is a Christian hope for this creation. This creation matters. It matters to God, and it matters He's invested it with a long-term future for eternity. This is a Christmas card I had just this Christmas, which is a really unusual Christmas card. It's not the sort of Christmas card you usually get, is it? It's a lion laying down with a lamb. You usually get pictures of Christmas trees, or if they think you're particularly religious, they give you a picture of, baby Jesus in a little crib. Here's a lion, and this Christmas card actually, I think, had got to the nub of it, because Christ was born in this world to bring the reconciliation that the new creation is portrayed as having in the Bible. It's a place where things will be right again. The lion shall lie down with the lamb. But I do obviously want to make the point that as well as that continuity of a place where we'll certainly feel at home, and we'll have physical bodies and so on, there is a discontinuity, obviously. It's a different sort of world. And Paul addressed this when somebody asked him, how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they have? And actually Paul's answer is, what a silly question, what a foolish question that is. And the reason he goes on to say is that when you sow an oak tree, you don't plant a little oak tree. You plant a seed, something that looks quite different, maybe of wheat or something else. But God gives it a body just as He's determined to do, and to each kind of seed He gives its own body. So there is a connection between the acorn and the oak tree, but they look quite different, don't they? You'd never guess by looking at the acorn that that's going to be an oak tree. And that's the sort of relationship, I guess, that there is between this creation and the new creation. There is a continuity, but there's a discontinuity as well. And that shouldn't surprise us. But what we do in this world does matter. Luther said, if I knew Jesus would return tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today. And other people have said similar things. This is a creation for which there is a long-term future. And it seems to me it's incumbent on Christians to actually care for it in a way that gives reality to that long-term future, to show we actually believe that, apart from anything else. And also, of course, if we're going to be doing it for all eternity, it wouldn't be a bad idea to start practicing now. I found this quote from C.S. Lewis, actually, who said this sort of thing in a different way. He said the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. He said, if you aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in. If you aim at earth, you get neither. And just the last quote, which is a very recent one, from the annual address that the President of the Royal Society said in his annual address. This is a secular society, and it's very interesting that the President of it should say something like this. Because he said, even in a cosmic or a geological time perspective, in other words, if we look right through the whole history of the universe, there's something unique about our century. Now, I know we don't like saying there's something unique, but there really is. Because, as he said, for the first time in its history, our entire planet's fate depends on our choices, what we do. And that seems to me to be even more incumbent on those of us who are from high-income countries with the ability to do something about it than from those who are suffering from it. As Jesus said, from everyone who's been given much, much will be demanded. From the one who's been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. And so that is a real reason for us to care. Christian view is holistic. There's a concern for the material as well as the spiritual reality of this world, because the new creation will embrace both aspects. And so we should care for God's creation in a manner that shows our love and obedience to Him. And obviously Christians ought to care for the stranger and the foreigner, even perhaps especially if they live on the other side of the world, and so we can't see them, but they're affected by our actions. So I think there's a strong imperative on us to take action, and part of that actually is just educating ourselves about these issues, and that's partly why we wrote that book that I mentioned at the beginning, which has the backing of Tear Fund and World Vision and the Catholic Bishops' Conference. So we're really hoping that that will actually just educate Christians about the fact they believe in a creator God, they believe in a new creation in the long term. We certainly ought to be taking a lead in these issues if nobody else is. Okay, so I'll stop there, thanks, and be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Anibal. It's good. So Question time, yes.
This is not a question, it's actually a comment. My year 12s were saying to me, is global warming true? And I went through all the reasons for, why I think it's really something we need to consider. The one thing that convinced them was looking at the exponential graph of population. They had never seen it before. And I found that quite remarkable. I don't know sort of what the situation would be here, but I suspect it's no different. It really was interesting that they never considered that before.
That's because you come from New Zealand.
Well, yes, I think
people do.
yes. I think it does have something to do with it, but
No, we don't see most of the people either, of course, because India's just passed 1 billion people a year ago, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
This may just be a technical detail, but on the graph of global temperature change, you discussed the change or the correlation and the interpretation of a Channel 4 programme. And then you referred to a Monet picture. Now the title of the slide said global temperature, but Monet painted that in London, and the Clean Air Acts would have been in the UK, presumably. Are you making a point that over the whole globe at that time that there was legislation, or are you saying that global temperatures were measured in London?
Yeah. Sorry, I should be clear on that. The global temperatures are true global temperatures averaged across all of the world. That's what they are. And that's why you can only do it accurately for the last 100 years or so when there's been good measurements. Individual places go up and down more than others. Land goes up more than sea because of the lag in it. And that picture, of course, was painted in London. Cleaning up the air, actually, that had that effect was really through the industrialised nations. That was North America, Britain, Northwest Europe, those sort of areas. And there wasn't a lot of industry in China and other places at that time. I suppose that there is an issue now that now China's becoming more polluting, and that may change the graph to change again. Maybe it will dip down, and the sceptics will say, "Oh, look, the graph's going down again, so that's all right." So yes, most of that pollution cleaning up was in the industrialised high-income nations in North of Europe and North America. But they were the ones that were making the pollution at that time. So,
Yes.
One of the things proposed on that programme was the 200-year time lag between the increased carbon dioxide levels and the global temperature, i.e. global temperature increased first and the increased carbon dioxide came after. So it being a result of the increased change for the oceans and whatnot. So how do you address that?
No, that is indeed true. Those global ice ages are driven by planetary changes in the circulation, in the way that the planets circulate the sun and so on. That is the driving force, and carbon dioxide probably followed that. There are complex feedbacks between the two, though, without a doubt. The world gets warmer, things grow much faster, you absorb much more carbon dioxide into growth temporarily, and vice versa. You release more carbon dioxide from those things that die as it gets colder. So you do get complex feedbacks, but the point is that the rate of change now is much faster than it's ever been, and we've gone right outside that limit. Carbon dioxide is way above anything it's seen in the last 600,000 years, way outside anything humanity has ever experienced, and at a rate of change which is higher. And we know there's an intimate link between carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas and the temperature. There's no doubt about that. I mean, in a way, that's what that global ice age thing shows. There is an intimate link between temperature and carbon dioxide. The exact feedbacks are very complicated. And one of the interesting things about the IPCC assessment is that they've missed out feedbacks by and large because they're not understood. So it's quite likely things will be worse than they say. They've put the lowest common denominator, if you will. So for instance, say in sea level rise, they haven't considered the fact that, and they say explicitly this is the case, that as there's more meltwater around, as the glaciers melt, you get hot, warm water on the base, which lubricates the flow, and the flow rates can double, and so the melting rate doubles. And they haven't put that in the models because there is some uncertainty about it. it is a complex system, but the key points there's no doubt about, and it might be worse than that. So I think it's a scary thought.
Yes, question in the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed what you say about us becoming stewards of God's creation and being vice regents. We're made in the image of God. But I just wonder, you're talking about vegetarians being able to contribute more because they are not taking so much of the earth's resources, so more could be spread around. Would you say that your argument is that Christians, although it's all there in Genesis, all of the mandates for us really taking stewardship of the earth, we are the worst offenders on the earth because we are ignoring all of these things. For example, in Genesis, people were given all of the grains and the plants to eat. And in the same way that you sing at the end time, the lion should lie down with the lamb, it wasn't until after Noah's flood that people started to eat meat. And if this is having an impact on the global warming, and all of the things that we're doing here, if it says I think it's in Deuteronomy, it gives us a command not to cut down too many trees because it's going to damage the earth. So it's all there in the Bible telling us what to do, and yet we don't do it.
Indeed so, and that's the point I'm trying to make, yes, that if Christians believe in a creator God and that there's a long-term future for the creation, we of all people ought to be taken care of. And actually say there's rules in, there's pointers in the Bible about caring for creation. Even when you're at war, it says don't chop down the trees, because after this war is finished, there's a long-term sustainable future. On the issue of vegetarianism, I certainly, having done this work, have become convinced that we should have a bias towards vegetarianism. I wouldn't go as far as say everybody should be vegetarian, but it's something Gordon Wenham, who's an Old Testament scholar, has written thick volumes on Genesis, gave a talk here and it's on the web, and he talked there about, he's convinced from that there should be a bias towards vegetarianism, and I think that's very wise, actually. And I enjoy meat and good steak as much as anyone, but I think we're consciously in our family just trying to eat a couple of vegetarian meals a week or something, at least because of that issue. Yeah.
Yes.
Just on a more practical point, how do you suggest we can, if we are members of a local church, how we could help to pass some of this on to people who maybe don't know, and also how the church can then take a role in educating the community?
Yes, well, of course, Christians are called to be countercultural, and it saddens me really that through the last half of the last century, Christians really didn't lead on the green agenda. They left it to tree huggers and so on. Now, that's not always been the case. Christians in historic times have shown a lot of care for the environment. They've often taken the lead in it, actually, particularly when you think about caring for animals, for instance. Wilberforce, for instance, founded the RSPCA to care for animals, as well as all the slavery and other stuff he did. So Christians have, we shouldn't beat ourselves too much, but there is no doubt that on this issue of climate change we ought to be countercultural. Practical things, there's a website about for churches. Rocher is another one, which has practical stuff about how you might respond. Changing your light bulbs, as I said, is a very good thing to do. You might make sure your church buys its energy from a renewable energy supplier. You might try and make yourself do it. It will cost you a bit more, but it might be a worthwhile thing to do. It is a worthwhile thing to do. So I think Christians should be modelling that counterculture in a variety of ways. That little booklet that I handed out for tomorrow too has some practical ideas in it as well, which will give you pointers to things. And our book has a chapter in the back about things you can do when it eventually comes back. But I think the first issue is just awareness raising so that people see what the consequences are of their actions. And I don't think you should tell people you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. But you should say this is a consequence of what you're doing. You should decide what your proper response is. I think that's a good way to do it.
Get on our bike whenever we can, whenever it's possible.
Yes, well, Dennis cycled this morning and I drove. So.
Yes.
Thanks again. We've heard the phrase theological category error a couple of times over the weekend, and I was wondering about quoting Psalm 65 and those rich words which you said. A reason that we should care for the environment is because God does. And I was wondering whether that did or didn't come into that category. John was talking to us this morning about divine action. Does it really make sense to say that God cares in an active sense for the environment, given the things that John was speaking to us about this morning? Is there something special or different going on, rather than, say, at a time of Earth's history when large supervolcanoes are splurging magma and large amounts of gas out into the environment? Is there something different about that at times in Earth's history? What do we think about that?
Well, what I think is that I know people sometimes think they equate volcanoes, earthquakes as being bad. That's a result of the fall, and nice green grass and lambs running around in it. It's good. That's God's good creation, and I think that's a category error. Because if we didn't have plate tectonics and volcanoes and earthquakes, we wouldn't have the dynamic Earth we live on, which is a place we could live, because they recycle a lot of the elements that we rely on. And so many people live on volcanoes in very dangerous places because the soil is so fertile. That's why they live there. So earthquakes and volcanoes are part of God's good creation. It's what actually maintains this world as a place, and the only place we know of at the moment in the universe, fit for human habitation. And I'm really looking forward to there being great volcanoes and earthquakes in the new creation.
So when we're reading Psalm 65 and thinking about fluffy lambs, the danger is to categorise the things that we think of as being comfortable and nice and pretty and beautiful about the environment as being the things that show God's care, rather than what we might think of as being contraindications. But I wasn't drawing the suggestion about the fall, although that is another direction that somebody might go in.
Well, Psalm 65 was speaking to a pastoral society, so it was talking about in terms they would understand, and they had flocks, they were nomadic often, and they needed to find pasture for them. So God, who provides pasture, is part of his good provision. The reason I quoted it was really to show the superabundant goodness of God, if you like, towards the earth, and the response of the earth. So the grasslands of the desert overflow, the hills are clothed with gladness, the meadows are covered with flocks, the valleys are mantled with grain, and they shout for joy and sing. I think that's the point I wanted to bring out, that there's nothing to do with humans shouting for joy and singing here. It's the creation that's shouting for joy and singing. And there is something about the human sinfulness which has caused all creation to be groaning. And creation is longing for the day when the Son of God will return and they'll be put back in that right order. So that there is an effect of human sinfulness on creation which is causing it to groan. The non-material creation the material creation as well as the non-living and the living creation is groaning under the results of sin. So that's what I wanted to draw out really. In God's order, in Psalm 65 for instance, and there's others as well we could have chosen, is a creation which is in its right relationship with God. It's joyful, it's even puts word in singing, it's so joyful. That's the picture that the psalmist uses. It's the right order of things.
Just
we
as
can
we
debate
need
that.
volcanoes, we also need bacteria. I don't know if you know that you have 10 times more bacteria in your bodies than you have your own cells. Okay, so you have about 10 to the 13 cells in your body, roughly this morning, depending on size. You have 10 to the 14 bacteria. So for every single human cell you have 10 bacteria. And the reason is that they're very small. So, and we need them to be alive. They're essential for our well-being. We can't do without them. So let's just sort of making an analogy there with volcanoes.
Rocks, yes.
We need volcanoes. We need bacteria as well. Pretty essential for life, as we know.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we got a couple of yes here and then there. Yes.
Just a quick comment to follow up Steve's point and to highlight what you said earlier, Bob. I think what you said to us, and I think what Martin Rees said in his presidential lecture, is really a very stark reminder of the responsibility that's been placed on us as creatures in God's image to do exactly what you said, to care for the environment.
Yeah, I would clearly never deny for a second we should care for the environment. I'm just curious about the last one. You said we have a long-term hope for the planet, for new creation. But how does that reconcile with cosmology, with Big Bang, where the sun's going to run out of hydrogen and engulf us in a red giant? There won't be an Earth.
Well, it's beyond present physics. I don't think our present understanding of physics necessarily encompasses the whole of God's purposes for his universe, actually. You know, we're his creatures, his understanding is many, many times our understanding. We see dimly, he knows. But the clear message of the Bible is there is a long-term future, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So maybe our present physics doesn't encompass that.
But we have a reasonable understanding of nuclear fusion, the sun, what it will do when it runs out of hydrogen.
Well, you might say that, but actually it's very striking that 95% of matter in the universe, we know nothing about. We call it black energy or black matter, because we don't know the first thing about it. Do we really know anything about the universe? That's one thing. Second thing is that the science is, I don't know if it's come out this weekend, but it really is provisional. You know, we're always changing. About every 30 years we change our minds. So Newton's laws were fine, but they're actually founded on incorrect presuppositions. They're actually wrong ideas behind them. Pragmatically they work. Einstein's laws were better. They're not the last word for sure. So I think we should be a little bit humble about our understanding of the universe and of our place in it. And if we are really God's created creatures, which I take we are, then, for instance, as the psalmist said, if we're the created pot, how can we tell the potter what his purposes were? Or if another picture of the Old Testament uses, if we're a hammer in somebody's arm, how can the hammer tell the arm what it's hitting? You know, we're his creatures, he has purposes which we don't necessarily know unless he tells us. And my view is that he has revealed himself through Scripture, through Jesus preeminently. You know, if Jesus said, if you want to know what God's like, look at me. So that's how we know what he's like. And what we know of his purposes is what he's revealed to us. And one of those things is that there will be a new creation, there will be a resurrection of which Jesus was the first and others will follow. So that's where I take that from, not from the laws of physics, but from the revealed truth of God.
But you're saying that new heavens and new earth is beyond the present space-time continuum in which we're in. That's what you're claiming.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm claiming. Yeah. I mean, Jesus came back with a risen body, which was recognisable. It bore the scars of his crucifixion, as we said last night. But it was different. He could walk through walls. He could appear and disappear. You know. So, but he had a body. So yeah, I'm sure physics will be different. Maybe physicists will have a place in the new creation too. Maybe.
But I think the question was: is this? Aren't we led by our scientific pursuits to believe that the Earth's going to be swallowed up by the sun becoming red?
But I mean, that is in billions of years time scale, I think. It's, you know, that's not, I mean, what we do about global warming is an immediate problem. It's not going to be not affected by the sun running out of nuclear fuel.
Yeah, but what's...
In 5 billion
I'm
years,
playing
who knows,
devil's
maybe
advocate
in
here.
5 billion
What's
years.
the point of looking after the Earth if it's going to be frazzled?
Well, because Jesus might return tomorrow, for example.
But I mean, looking after the Earth into kind of eternity, if our science tells us it's going to be.
Well, we don't know when Jesus will call an end to this world, do we? That's one of the big unknowns. And he could come tomorrow, literally. And, you know, then what will he say to us? Well done, good and faithful steward, or be far from me, you didn't do what I told you to do. Oh yeah, I think that's a real issue. And, you know, I'll let 5 billion years' time care for itself. All the people that are living then, I don't know what they'll do, get on a spaceship, go to some other system, if we last 5 billion years. I don't know how long we'll last, but we should live every, you know, that old hymn, live every day as if you're last. That's great philosophy for life, actually. So you might think it sounds morbid, but I don't think it is, actually. You should live in the light of eternity in that sense.
I'm just interested in what you had to say in that my house will one day fall down and be just dust and rubble, but I hope my children are treating it with respect today, because I'd like to go home, and their respect for our home represents their love for me and my love for them, and undoubtedly in 100 years my house will very likely not be there. It'll just be dust and rubble and dirt, but I expect them to treat me with respect today. No question.
We've got one extra item on the programme, which is a short item, and I think probably what we'll do now is to hand over to John Ling for a few minutes. Or do you want to introduce this, Rodney? Rodney's going to say a word about this. Okay, so, but first of all, before we do that, can we just thank Bob very much indeed for that.